Good evening, everybody. I'm Dolores O'Riordan. I'm the Director of UCD's Institute of Food and Health, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Institute's first public lecture of 2022. The Institute of Food and Health runs this lecture series to provide you, the public, with the latest scientific knowledge on matters related to food and public health. We are aware of the wealth of information available in the media and often how confusing it can be to distinguish fact from fiction. So we're committed to giving you access to the experts in the field and to help inform your food choices. So tonight's talk is on the important topic of adolescent nutrition. We will hear what constitutes a balanced diet for adolescents, delivered by an expert in the field, Dr. Breige McNulty. Now, Breige is a graduate in human nutrition from the University of Coleraine, and she also completed her PhD in Coleraine. She joined UCD in 2013 and was appointed as Assistant Professor in Human Nutrition in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in 2015. At UCD, Breige is responsible for managing the National Food Consumption Survey in Ireland. Her main research interest is in the area of food consumption and using this food consumption data to understand the impact of nutrients, food, ingredients, and chemicals on our health, with a view to underpinning both food safety and food policy. Now, a key aspect of these public talks is to provide you, the audience, with an opportunity to ask questions. We'll respond to these questions at the end of Breige's talk. So I invite you to pose your questions through the question and answers tab in your Zoom link. And my colleague, Professor Lorraine Brennan, will moderate these questions, and she'll do her very best to get through as many questions as possible that you pose. Breige will answer these questions then, and she'll be joined by Dr. Katie Horner. Katie is a lecturer in sport and exercise science at UCD, and she teaches and researches in the area of exercise physiology and nutrition. And she's also a registered nutritionist. She currently works as part of the Ad Astra Academy Athlete Support Team at UCD. So keep posting your questions throughout the lecture, and Breige and Katie, with the help of Lorraine moderating the questions, will get back to you at the end. Now, tonight's talk will be recorded and will be made available to you on the UCD Institute of Food and Health website. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Breige McNulty. So over to you, Breige.
Thanks, Dolores. And welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. So for the next 30 or so minutes, what I hope to do is take you through nutrition and the important points in relation to adolescence in that period of time and how that really relates to foundations for lifelong health. So I'm going to split the lecture into two parts. Firstly, I want to really talk about the developmental changes in adolescence and how or what considerations we need to be aware of when it comes to nutrition. And then the second part at the end, I just want to touch on other considerations that we may have to think about during this period of time. So just to set the scene, I suppose, I think during the adolescent period, we should all be aware that it's kind of a very sensitive nutrition period. And nutrition has a really important role to play in how we develop and grow over that period of time. And if we have adequate nutrition during that period of time, what it can actually do is reduce the risk of certain chronic diseases such as obesity, cancer, cardiovascular disease later in life. Hence, it starts to lay that foundation of lifelong health during this period of time. And this is why nutrition is so important during this life stage. So what are the developmental changes that are happening? Well, we probably all know them. And the first of all is physically. So physically, when we come from childhood into adolescence, puberty begins. And what we see is this rapid change in growth. And that's not only our height, but also our body composition changes during this period of time. And hence nutrition is important for these components, but it's not to forget also that, you know, there are other changes happening as well. And that's cognitive and emotionally as well. We become greater abstract thinking. We have our goal setting at this point. We want to become more independent. And this all plays into the role of how we make our food choices at this point in time. I'll come back to this later because I think it's really important that we consider it. So in terms of physical changes, it's one of the most rapid phases of growth that we see during all the life stages, is during this adolescent period. So this is from when we hit our teenage years, from around 13 right up until we're 18 years of age. And one of the most noticeable things that happen is height. So although we grow during our childhood, obviously, during adolescence, we see this huge spurt or growth spurt that happens at some point during adolescence. So it's over a 2 to 3 year period. And this is where we dramatically increase our height during this period of time. And girls will go into this growth spurt quite earlier compared to boys, but boys will actually grow higher or have a higher height, with the average being about 23 centimeters. So what's actually happening during this period of time? And when we think about it, it's our obviously bones, they're growing. So our long bones, so those bones that are in our legs and in our arms are growing longer, they're expanding, hence we increase our height. But it's not just this, it's also the mineralization that's happening during this period of time. So if we look at this figure over here, this diagram of a spine, and it's cut into our bone, and what we can see here is the density underneath. So this is our bone mineral density, and it has a lattice effect. And what we're trying to do during this period of time is lay down as much bone mineral density so we can have stronger bones. And the reason it's really important during our adolescent years is that we actually lay down about 40% of our bone mass during this period of time. So this graph here shows bone mass, the amount that we lay down, and over the lifespan of our lives. And as you can see, it starts when obviously we're born, but the greatest rate of increase, if we look at 10 to 20, is at this point in time, so is in our adolescent years. So this is the amount that we put down the fastest. We reach our peak, so we reach the maximum amount we're going to lay down at about the age of 30. And then what happens is we start to gradually lose that bone mineral density. And that has problems later in life if we don't have enough early in life, because therefore we lose too much, and this can lead to osteoporosis. So it is a risk for later in life if we don't have adequate bone mineral density early in life. So hence, it's really important to get adequate nutrition in order to do this. And I suppose we may all know that the most important nutrient when it comes to bone growth is calcium. So the strength and density of bones is decided during those teenage years, and it's the peak period for calcium requirements because of that. So during all our different life stages, calcium requirements are at the highest during our adolescence stage. And what we are supposed to be consuming is about 1,150 milligrams per day. Now, recently we've done research looking at adolescent diets in Ireland. So we previously did a survey back in 2005, and we've recently published the next one, the second one, the National Teens Food Survey 2 in 2019. And what we did find when we looked at calcium intakes in our teenagers in Ireland is that actually 51% of teenagers are actually not meeting this calcium requirement. And the average intakes was about 812 milligrams per day. So this is an issue. We really do need to increase the amount of calcium adolescents are consuming. And if we look at the food-based dietary guidelines, so these are the recommendations, calcium we really will get from the dairy group. So it's our milk, it's our yogurt, and our cheese. And we're advised to have 5 servings of these per day. And you can see just from the images here what a serving is. So you can have a glass of milk, 200 milligrams will provide about 240 milligrams of calcium, or a small pot of yogurt, 125 grams, would provide about 180 milligrams of calcium. The problem is when we did look at the adolescents diet, what we found in the 2019 teen surveys that we did, actually overall milk consumption has actually dropped. So our adolescents are actually consuming less milk. So it's really important to get this across, I think, that, we should be consuming our dairy. And that's not to say that dairy is the only way we can get our calcium. It just means that there's a higher amount of calcium in these sources. So without forgetting, I suppose, the other nutrient that we really need to consider when we talk about bone and bone development is vitamin D. So calcium and vitamin D go really hand in hand. because without vitamin D, well, we need vitamin D in order to regulate the amount of calcium. So in relation to calcium metabolism in our body, we really need the two. And the reason vitamin D is important is that we actually don't get enough of it. We all know, I suppose, with vitamin D and the relationship that we've heard in relation to COVID and our immune system, that we actually have very low intakes of vitamin D, and our adolescents are no different. We require about 10 micrograms per day of vitamin D in our diets. And when we look at the adequacy in our teenagers, it's only at 94%. Inadequate intakes. So 94% of the adolescents that we surveyed weren't actually getting that requirement. And the average intake was about 3.7 micrograms per day. So again, we need to increase our intakes. You can see oily fish, eggs will be really good sources of vitamin D in the diet, but also fortified foods. So we have a lot of fortified foods on the Irish market, such as breakfast cereals, such as our fortified milks, that would also have a really good supply of vitamin D or increased vitamin D intakes. It is also recognised that potentially if we want to take a supplement during the winter months, because obviously we can get vitamin D from sunlight, but during the winter months, we are especially not going to get the vitamin D that we require. So there is a recommendation that we can take a 10 microgram supplementation in the diet. And that would be the advice for adolescents as well. So moving on from bone and how that's important to lay down our bone mineral density early in life, we can next move on to, I suppose, the other physical change is our body composition during this time. So entering adolescence, both genders, male and females, will come in at more or less the same amount of lean body mass or muscle mass and fat mass. But then due to puberty and the changes in hormones, what we see is that we see a slight difference then in males and females, where males will gain more muscle mass and have hairier skeletons. And if we looked at the previous bone mineral density graph, you'll see that males actually attain a higher bone mineral density. The opposite can be said, and females will gain slightly more fat. And of course, menstruation begins at this point. So what's important about this is that we need to make sure that we manage the optimal growth here. So because of this change in hormones, because of this change in body composition and increased energy intakes, we see that our appetites will obviously increase during adolescence as well. And we have to make sure that we manage that increased appetite without excessive weight gain. And the reason being is that there's potential consequences of too much weight or becoming or having obesity in the adolescence period. So there's studies that have shown that if adolescents, 80% of obese adolescents will actually become or stay obese during their adulthood. So they'll maintain that obesity. And that has lifelong risks for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes. And unfortunately, when we did look at the data from the surveys from the NTFS back in 2005 and the newer survey in 2019, we do see that we have got an increase in those suffering from obesity. So if we just look at the obese category, it was 3% prevalence in 2005. And unfortunately, now we're seeing about 8% prevalence. So this is a major thing that we need to be able to manage the amount of weight that we're gaining during this period of time. So how much energy do we need? Because obviously in weight that we gain, it's energy that we haven't used. And very simply put, if we look at this bar chart, or sorry, this graph here, energy comes from the food that we consume. And we use it up by obviously the base metabolic rate. And this is how much energy normally our body needs to do its normal functions. And then over and above our physical activity. So the more physical activity you are, the more energy you need to equal this balance. The less physical activity and the more obviously food that you consume, you're going to gain weight by laying down that energy. And our bodies are really good at storing the energy if we don't use it up. And for adolescents, it really depends, like adults, how much energy is being used, and really from this variable part here, from the physical activity. So for example, if we take a teenage girl, If they're more sedentary activity, so they don't use too much during physical activity, they don't do too much physical activity, then their requirements is about 1,800 calories per day. If they're more active, moderately active, it will be up to 2,000 calories a day. So it does vary, and it's the same for teenage boys. Slightly more energy is required for teenage boys. And where do we get this energy from? Well, it's advised that we get it across the macronutrients being carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So the recommendations is that we get the most from our carbohydrates. So about 45 to 60% of the calories that we should be consuming should come from a carbohydrate source. 12 to 15% should be coming from a protein source, and 20 to 35% should be coming from a fat source. And that's what we'd like to see. It's not that we would like to eliminate any of those. I know some people will think that fat is bad, but we need fat in our diet, but we need a certain amount. So we don't need too much and we don't need too little. So it's all about the balance. So just going back to the carbohydrates, and it is recommended that 45 to 60% of energy should be coming from carbohydrates. And it's recommended that depending on the amount of activity, that would differ in how many servings that you would have during the day. So for example, if you were a female that was inactive, that you would require about 3 servings a day. And if you look, just one serving here is these below images. So a serving could be 2 thin slices of homemade bread, or for example, a cup of cooked rice. For meals, it's slightly different. It's more servings because they have higher energy requirements. So for a moderately active meal, it can be between 5 to 7 servings. An important point here is that it's wholemeal servings that we're looking for as well. So just not to forget that it's just not all carbohydrates. We would really recommend wholemeal sources of carbohydrates. And the reason being, it is to increase that fiber content in our diet. So fiber is really important. It's important for all age groups, but obviously in adolescents, it's important. And there's strong evidence that suggests that if we eat plenty of fiber, we have a lower risk of chronic diseases in later life. When we looked at in Irish teenagers, it was about 17 grams that we were seeing that was being consumed. And we'd like to see that higher. We'd like to see that between 18 to 25 grams. So they aren't meeting the recommendation in relation to fiber. Another important question is how much protein. So in relation to protein, what we see is that 12 to 15% of energy should be coming from protein sources. And during the adolescent periods, that really hits the peak with the growth spurt, because obviously we need that protein for the muscle development, the repair of our muscles, and also the production of enzymes and hormones. Again, it differs depending on the stage of development. So as we get older, our protein requirements slightly increase. And it also is based on your weight. So just to give you some calculations here, so if we were to look at a 60 kilogram male, and the recommendation is either between 0.86 to 0.1 per kilogram weight of males. So the recommendation would be about 52 to 55 grams of protein per day. So it's actually not a huge amount of protein. And what I can see from when we looked at protein intakes, again, from the NTFS2, there wasn't an issue with protein. So the amount of energy we were getting from protein sources was about 17%. So we do get adequate protein within our diets. And just to note that the food-based dietary guidelines for protein intake would be about 2 servings per day. And that comes from not only animal sources, you can see meat, poultry, but also fish and eggs, and also plant-based foods as well. So your beans, nuts, and soya, and tofu. The other components that make up, I suppose, our energy intakes is fat and sugar, and it's not to forget about these. And as I said, we don't want to eliminate any macronutrients out of our diets completely, and fat potentially is demonized a lot. We need about 20 to 35% of our energy coming from fat, and that's the same for adolescents. And it's really important for that, giving us the energy, and especially during that adolescent period when there's a lot of growth. But again, it's about balance, that we shouldn't take or consume too much more than that. And also 10% or 10% or less should come from saturated sources. And that being said, because saturated fat or high saturated fat diets have been linked to cardiovascular disease. And with everything in adolescence, it's about, I suppose, developing them healthy habits. It's like everything, we can develop bad habits very easily, and we can develop healthy, it's sometimes harder to develop healthy habits. So if we can develop these habits really early in life and during that adolescence, they will continue during to adulthood and potentially decrease that risk of having high saturated fat intakes later in life. In terms of when we looked at it in our Irish population in the adolescents, what we see is 35% of energy does come from fat. So we're within that guideline, but actually 14% of that energy is from saturated fat. So we should be considerate of trying to lower those saturated sources of fat within the diet. Again, sugar is a source of energy, but it's also related to dental carriers, and it also potentially can add to that weight increase or the energy that we're storing. The recommendation is from the WHO that we should have 10% or less coming from free sugars. So free sugars are the term that we use for sugars that are added in during that manufacturing process, or when foods are produced, or from potential fruits that are fruit juices or smoothies. And what we did see from the Irish teenage data is that 9% of energy does come from free sugars. So we were below that recommendation, but there was still about 30% of children who did have higher than that. So there is still a certain amount of the population that would have higher amounts of free sugars, and we should be considerate of that. And really the recommendation is that when it comes to food and drinks high in fat and sugar and salt, that we should limit that. And we should have about once or twice a week, but definitely not every day. And that's for adults and teenagers alike. So there's two other nutrients that I wanted to talk about when it comes to adolescent nutrition and, laying them foundations. And one is salt. And the problem with salt, I suppose, is that if we eat too much salt, it's actually quite hard for our kidneys to remove fluid from our system. And that actual increase in fluid can increase our blood pressure. That over time can lead to hypertension. And what we're seeing now is the actual rates and prevalence of hypertension are increasing in not only adolescents, but in children. So we may think that this is a disease, or hypertension is a disease in adulthood, but what we're seeing is potentially we're seeing it more in adolescents and children. And that again leads to persistent hypertension throughout life and the increase of risk of cardiovascular disease later in life. So we need to think about salt as well within our diets and our adolescents intakes of salt. And the salt recommendation is that we should be consuming less than 6 grams of salt per day. When we looked at this in our adolescent population group, what we're seeing, and we base this on urinary data, is that the daily intake of salt was around 6 grams per day. So it's higher than the recommendation. We would want to see it below that. So we should be considerate that potentially we need to reduce the salt within adolescent diets as well for that reason. And the other nutrient that I wanted to note, I suppose, is iron. Iron's really important, and it's especially important during adolescence, because what we see during that period is there's an increased blood flow, blood volume, increase in lean body mass, and obviously in puberty in teenage girls, there's the onset of menstruation. And that means that we have a higher requirement overall for iron, and especially in girls. So in females, it's 30 milligrams per day that girls should be consuming, and 11 milligrams for boys. Now, the problem is if we don't get enough iron, we start to feel tired, we have short of breath, we become pale, so we have anemia. So iron deficiency anemia is what it's called. And short term, maybe not such a problem, but long term, it potentially can compromise that growth that were happening during that period of time. It can also decrease cognitive function. So, if we're tired and we're not able to concentrate during that period of adolescence, when we're in school, we're trying to study, it's potentially going to have a negative consequence. And it also has been linked to a depressed immune function as well. So it potentially can increase the risk of infections. The problem is when we looked at it in our population group, what we see is in teenage girls, the actual average intake was about 9.4 milligrams per day. So that's way below where we would like to see the 30 milligrams. But it was actually higher for teenage boys at 12.7 milligrams per day. So there tends to be a difference in the amount of iron coming in from the diet based on females and males. And again, this could be to do with the different foods that are being consumed within those different groups. It's important to note the iron sources that we can get in our diet. They come from a variety of sources, so it's not just meat. Obviously red meat would have a really high source of iron, so 2 milligrams per serving, but also we can get it from more fortified foods. Again, green leafy vegetables and pulses as well are really good sources. And also to note with this that if we consume vitamin C with the meal that we're consuming iron with, that will help our absorption of iron. So it's really good. But also there are things that can hinder it. And tea and coffee are one of those things. So if we drink coffee with a meal that contains iron, it'll actually be a negative in that it contains polyphenols and potential tea and coffee. So they contain tannins. And that makes it actually harder for our body to absorb that iron. So it's just to be careful or mindful when we're trying to increase the iron sources within our diet to consider maybe having a glass of orange juice with or maybe some more fruit and veg with that potential serving of meat, and to avoid drinking tea and coffee with that meal. Okay. So that's kind of the main, I suppose, considerations when it comes to nutritional requirements and how they fit in with the physical changes that we see during adolescence. But I wanted to kind of touch on other considerations that we probably need to bear in mind that are happening also. And the three kind of areas I want to briefly touch on are kind of restrictive diets, plant-based diets, and sports nutrition, or teenagers that do sports. And I think this comes back to food choice factors. So when I said at the start, there's a lot of changes that happen, and not only physical, it's the emotional and cognitive changes that are also happening. And our children are growing up and they're becoming adults during this period of time, and they're, having their own independence. And therefore, the reasons that they choose food or make food choices is very personal. It can have environmental factors, and also it could be related to health status. So there's lots of different factors that we need to be aware of. Sugar. In relation to restrictive and fad diets, some teenagers may try to, for example, control their weight by unsuitable methods. And by unsuitable methods, potentially just removing foods or food groups completely out of diet to try and control their weight. And obviously this is a time when body composition is changing. Also, some teenagers may want to try certain popular social media diets because they've seen them and they want to try them, and they want to have a control over their food. And it's important, I think, to educate adolescents and for them to be able to know the scientific evidence and to look for the scientific evidence behind these methods. So whether it's a popularized social media diet, is it actually an expert behind that diet? Is there scientific reasoning? If you were to exclude groups, what does that mean for my diet? And what are the implications for me? Because it's really important that they have enough energy and nutrients for their growth and development at that point, because some of the times we can't go back through that period of time, and we can't build back up, such as bone mineral density, because of the rates that we're increasing at that period of time. And the other thing that comes up a lot is plant-based diets. And I think this comes up a lot with all population groups. And I think that's sustainability. So we all know about sustainability, and it's something that we really have to consider going forward. And plant-based diets can be healthy. It's not that they can't be healthy. And I suppose we can look at it in plant-based diets by a plant-based diet is about improving the amount of plant-based products within our diet. But also you can go into looking at vegetarian, potentially vegan diets as well. So it's not that they can't be healthy, but I think planning is key, because there is such a high amount of nutrients and certain nutrients such as calcium that is needed during these periods of time. It's really that anyone that wants to undertake this type of diet, that they need to understand what foods give them benefits, and if they're removing a particular food, then what foods do they need to consume more of to have that nutritional adequacy? And just to look, I suppose, at animal versus plant sources, as I said, there are plenty of sources or animal sources, plenty of plant sources that will provide those key nutrients such as protein, calcium and iron. And vitamin B12, although I didn't touch on it, B12 predominantly we get from meat sources. So for example, if anyone was to totally exclude that meat source from all meat sources or animal products out of their diet altogether, they really need to consider where they're going to get these particular nutrients, such as B12. And there is a lot of fortified foods on the Irish market that we can potentially introduce. And for example, yeast extract as well is another way of getting B12. And for example, calcium, green leafy vegetables, breads are fortified with calcium as well. Nuts and dry foods are really good sources as well. So it's just having that balance and planning it instead of just avoiding food groups and not thinking about, okay, well, what other sources do now I need to include in my diet. And I suppose I'm not being critical, but there's a lot of plant-based products now onto the market, and I think it's ever increasing. We can go into the supermarket and we'll see all these different variations of potentially meat alternatives or micro-protein corn or vegetables used in a different way to potentially remove meat from our diets. I just like to say they're not always healthy alternatives. So again, we need to consider those nutrients that potentially add energy. So the fat content and potential saturated fat content, and also that nutrients potentially that can be causing harm, such as sodium. It's not to say that they aren't nutritional, but it's to look at the labels and to consider that when we're kind of moving towards more of a processed plant alternative. So now just to go on to teens and sports, and I just like to say I'm not an expert in the field, and hopefully Katie will be able to answer more questions in relation to this if you have any. But I have taken this from Safe Food and INDI, so have made this really lovely booklet, Fuel Your Body for the teenage sport person. So I highly recommend that you can download the PDF from that. And they have a whole area around, I suppose, teenage and sports, but just to pull out their key recommendations. And very much it's similar to what we would recommend for a normal healthy diet. So we're talking about make sure you drink plenty of fluids, that you're a good source of protein, your carbohydrates, you eat your 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, iron and calcium, that you've good sources, etc., etc. So all of those performance recommendations that they have in that will be the natural really recommendations that we have with normal dietary guidelines. But just to pull two out that I thought really kind of stood out to me and maybe of concerns is first supplementation. So there's a lot of supplementation in and around sports. And really there are no quick fixes in trying to attain, I suppose, a higher level of muscle mass, etc., when it comes to supplementation. But they are not recommended for teenagers. That is the thing that really popped out to me. And it's to do with that there's no studies or real studies done on supplementation in teenagers, and they're not needed. So it's just to point that out. Another thing is fluids and hydration. Obviously, this is really important, not only in sports, but overall, because once we're properly hydrated, we are better able to function cognitively and therefore better able to concentrate in our studies. Water is always the best choice of fluid, but also low-fat milk is good at replacing lost fluids. And it does suggest that isotonic sport drinks can be good for during and after long, intense periods. So that would be quite an intense period of exercise or sports, but you shouldn't use them every day. And just to kind of finish off with the overall recommendations that we would have. So when it comes to adolescents nutrition, all meals are important, including breakfast. It's important to snack and eat your main meals throughout the day. It's important because we need a lot of energy during this period of time, and we need it regularly. And it's important to enjoy that as well, because what we're doing is we're, at this period of time, we're laying down the foundations of really good long-term habits and good nutritional habits and dietary habits to lead us on into a healthier adulthood. Include good sources of protein, fats, and carbohydrates. It's really important to have them adequate sources, that they provide the energy and the other components that we need during that period of growth. I didn't pull it out too much, but remember to include a rainbow of fruit and vegetables. A rainbow, because when we include a rainbow, we include in variety, and variety means that we include all the different nutrients and the minerals and vitamins that we need. We're recommended to have 5 to 7 in adulthood and adolescence. And unfortunately, when we look at data for adolescents, they're just below 3 recommended fruit and veg servings per day. So we really need to increase the amount, and maybe, increasing more plant-based foods, would help to increase that level of fruit and veg within our diets. Stay hydrated, drink plenty of fluids. Obviously, that's important in sports, but also important for regular day-to-day life, because of its link with, cognition, and get enough rest and sleep. So it's really important that adolescents have enough rest time, downtime, but also sleep time. So not to be, late into the night on different devices maybe, but to get a good night's sleep, because sleep is really important for growth as well. And there has been studies to link that if people who have less sleep potentially have an increased risk of gaining weight as well. So it's really important that we get in that adequate night's sleep, and to stay active. I didn't touch on this, obviously this is nutrition, but it's really important, physical activity in everything we do, and especially in adolescence, and will help maintain weight status. And lastly, just to note some of the resources, like there is a wealth of information out there on adolescence nutrition. Firstly, just the food-based dietary guidelines. So you can download the PDF in relation to healthy eating, food safety, and food legalization from their website, but also the INDI, Safe Food, Board BIA, all have really good resources on their website. And again, just to remind you, there's a really good PDF that you'll find through the INDI or Safe Food in relation to the teenage sports person, and it gives you recommendations of foods as well, and diet plans. So I think that's really useful. And I'm going to thank you very much for listening to me, and then open the floor to any questions.